Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Enough of this charade," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This court has indulged your little performance long enough. You are not a real lawyer, and I refuse to waste this court's time any further." Laughter rippled through the room. The defense attorney shook his head, looking at Jordan like he was some naive child who had wandered into the wrong room. Even the landlord, seated smugly at his table, chuckled under his breath. But Jordan didn't flinch. He remained still, eyes locked on the judge with a quiet intensity that made the room feel suddenly uneasy. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into his folder and pulled out a document. He placed it neatly on the table, tapping it once for emphasis. "Your Honor," Jordan said, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel, "before you dismiss me, perhaps you should read this." The judge scoffed, but took the paper anyway, his expression still smug, until his eyes scanned the contents. His smirk vanished. The silence stretched. The reporters stopped scribbling. The opposing attorney leaned in, confused, as Whitmore's grip on the paper tightened. "What?" The judge's voice faltered for the first time. Jordan clasped his hands together, his confidence unwavering. "That, Your Honor, is a Supreme Court ruling that allows non-licensed legal representatives to argue in certain civil cases. Cases exactly like this one." He tilted his head slightly. "Which means, legally, you can't throw me out. And if you try, that's called judicial misconduct." A stunned hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Whitmore's face darkened. The landlord shifted uncomfortably. The defense attorney paled. Jordan leaned forward just slightly, his voice razor-sharp. "Your Honor, shall we continue? But before we go any deeper, tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you love stories about justice and standing up against corruption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one. This setup builds maximum anticipation, setting up the moment where Jordan flips the power dynamic in his favor, forcing even the arrogant judge to acknowledge him. Want any tweaks? The heavy humidity of an Atlanta afternoon clung to the grand marble pillars of the Fulton County Courthouse, a towering structure that had seen decades of trials, scandals, and legal battles that shaped the city's history. Inside, the grand courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Spectators whispered among themselves, reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and cameras from local news stations discreetly captured the unfolding drama. Lawyers in expensive suits sat with their arms crossed, exchanging amused glances as if they were about to witness a spectacle rather than a legal proceeding. The air buzzed with an unspoken understanding. No one expected this to be a serious case, not when the one standing at the plaintiff's table was a 16-year-old black boy. At the elevated bench, presiding over the courtroom like a monarch on his throne, sat Judge Richard Whitmore. He was a man whose very presence demanded submission, his reputation built on decades of ruthless rulings, sharp-tongued insults, and a history of making defendants, particularly black defendants, feel small. His deep-set eyes carried the weariness of a man who had seen it all, but his smirk hinted at the pleasure he took in reminding those beneath him of their place. He was notorious for his condescension, infamous for the way he dismissed young lawyers, and downright brutal when it came to those who dared to challenge his authority. The moment he had entered the room, the air had shifted. His robe billowed as he took his seat, tapping his gavel once to command silence, and then his eyes had fallen on the boy at the plaintiff's table, the barely concealed amusement flickering across his face. Jordan Ellis stood in that spot, unfazed. 16 years old, neatly dressed in a crisp navy suit that had once belonged to his grandfather, the sleeves just slightly too long. He was tall for his age, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes carried a quiet defiance that made it impossible to look away. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as attorneys exchanged smirks, their eyes scanning him like a novelty, something to be mocked. The opposing lawyer, a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and an air of effortless arrogance, leaned against his table and let out a slow chuckle. "This is adorable," he drawled, shaking his head in mock disbelief. A high schooler playing dress-up as an attorney. Are we sure this isn't a school project? Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back whispered, "This is a joke, right?" But Jordan remained still, his hands resting on the table, his breathing steady. He didn't flinch, didn't react. He had been underestimated before, and soon they would all realize just how wrong they were. Judge Whitmore let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, shaking his head as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His sharp eyes flickered with something between amusement and irritation as he studied Jordan, his lips curving into a smirk. A child pretending to be a lawyer. This must be a joke. His voice dripped with condescension, carrying the weight of his authority, and the courtroom wasted no time erupting into laughter. It started with a few chuckles, then grew louder as attorneys whispered to each other, heads shaking, some openly scoffing. A woman near the back covered her mouth, as if trying to stifle her amusement, but failing. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered, and the comment spread like wildfire, rippling through the crowd. At the defense table, the opposing attorney grinned, shaking his head before turning to his client, a smug-looking man in a tailored suit who smirked right back at him. It was clear they weren't taking this seriously. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to Jordan, as if expecting him to shrink under the weight of the ridicule. But Jordan didn't move. He didn't blink. His hands rested steadily on the table, his breathing even, his expression unreadable. He had been here before. Mocked, doubted, dismissed. But experience had taught him something that none of these people seemed to understand yet. Underestimation was a weapon, and right now, he was letting them hand it to him willingly. Judge Whitmore tapped his gavel once, though there was no urgency in his motion. The laughter died down slowly, still laced with lingering murmurs. He exhaled through his nose, feigning patience. "Son, I suggest you take a long, hard look around this courtroom. You see, this is a place for real attorneys, real cases, real consequences. And while I admire whatever high school drama club convinced you this was a good idea, I'd advise you not to waste this court's time." Jordan finally moved, his head tilting slightly as he met the judge's eyes. The room was still buzzing with whispers, but when he spoke, his voice cut through the noise like steel. "I understand the seriousness of this court, Your Honor. That's why I'm here." His tone was calm, controlled, free of the nervous waver they had all been expecting. He reached into his neatly organized folder, pulling out a document, and placed it carefully on the table. "As a representative for my client, I am exercising her right to due process under the law. If the defense is done laughing, I'd like to begin." The shift was almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. The amused expressions flickered into something else. Something hesitant, something wary. Judge Whitmore's smirk twitched, but he covered it with another sigh, clearly unimpressed. "Fine. You want to play lawyer? Go ahead. Let's hear this so-called case of yours." Jordan nodded once, then turned his attention to the courtroom. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had already won. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, I'd like to begin by stating the fundamental issue at hand. My client, Tasha Green, has been unlawfully targeted for eviction. The defense claims lease violations, but what they fail to mention is the lack of substantial evidence to support these claims. I will prove, beyond any doubt, that this eviction is not only baseless, but deliberately orchestrated for financial gain." The confidence in his tone was unnerving. His words weren't those of a desperate kid trying to sound smart. They were sharp, deliberate, layered with knowledge that had no business coming from a 16-year-old. And then, he started picking apart the opposition's case. The defense alleges that my client breached her lease agreement by exceeding the allowed occupancy limit. However, the official lease agreement, which I have submitted as Exhibit A, does not state a numerical limit on occupants, only that all residents must be listed. My client has provided documentation that proves she has done so. The opposing attorney, who had been grinning moments ago, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his client. Jordan didn't stop. Furthermore, the defense claims excessive noise violations, yet has failed to provide a single formal noise complaint filed against my client in the past year. In fact, upon reviewing building management records, which I will present as Exhibit B, there is clear evidence that complaints were only logged after my client refused to accept an illegal rent increase. A noticeable ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling for a moment. Judge Whitmore's face, which had been set in a smirk minutes ago, was no longer amused. He sat up slightly, his fingers steepled in front of him, eyes narrowing. The opposing attorney opened his mouth to object, then hesitated. Jordan let the silence stretch just long enough. "This is not about a lease violation," he continued, his voice unwavering. "This is about a landlord attempting to push out a low-income tenant to make room for higher profits. It is predatory, it is unethical, and it is illegal." For the first time since the hearing had started, the courtroom wasn't laughing. It was listening. Henry Ellis had spent a lifetime fighting battles that seemed impossible to win. A retired history teacher and former civil rights activist, he had seen the world change, seen laws shift on paper but not always in practice. He had marched, protested, and spent nights in jail for demanding equality, but the fight never truly ended. It just evolved. And now, it had taken on a new form through his grandson. From the moment Jordan was born, Henry had recognized something in him, a sharpness, an awareness far beyond his years. While other kids memorized multiplication tables, Jordan devoured books on constitutional law. At 8, he would sit cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through Henry's old law textbooks, asking questions no child should have even known to ask. If separate but equal was never really equal, why did it take so long to prove it? Because some laws protect people and others trap them. Henry never spoke to him like a child. He answered every question honestly, even when the truth was heavy. By the time Jordan was 12, Henry had taken him to sit in on college lectures just to see if he could keep up. He didn't just keep up, he debated. Professors who had spent decades teaching legal theory found themselves challenged by a preteen who had memorized case law like it was a second language. His mind was a weapon, sharp and precise, but what made Jordan different wasn't just his intelligence, it was his heart. He didn't care about proving he was the smartest in the room. He wasn't interested in being a prodigy, in impressing people with his knowledge. He wanted justice, and he wanted it in the simplest, purest form, the kind Henry had spent his life fighting for. "Use your mind, boy," Henry would always say. "Your mind is your power, and when they can't take that from you, they'll try to break your spirit instead. Never let them." Jordan never forgot that lesson. He kept his head down, avoided unnecessary attention, and focused on what mattered: learning, understanding, and preparing. He had no illusions about the world. He knew what people would see first when they looked at him: a black teenager, too young, too bold, someone who didn't belong in their circles. But he also knew something else. They would underestimate him, and that was always their first mistake. The day everything changed started out like any other. Henry had sent Jordan to the local grocery store to grab a few things, nothing urgent. He had taken his time, wandering the aisles, lost in thought, when he heard it, a voice, thick with panic and grief, quiet but desperate. He turned the corner near the checkout lines and saw her, a woman, mid-30s, holding on to a small child while trying to keep her voice steady as she spoke to the cashier. "I don't know what to do," she was saying, her breath hitching. "He says I violated the lease, but I didn't. I swear I didn't." The little girl clutched at her mother's shirt, looking up at her with wide, frightened eyes. The cashier, an older woman, was shaking her head, offering words of sympathy but no real help. Jordan stopped. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him to listen. "Tasha, I wish I could do something," the cashier said softly. "You've been living there for years. This just don't seem right." Tasha Green wiped at her eyes quickly, glancing around as if embarrassed by her own desperation. "I paid every cent on time," she whispered. "But he says I have too many people living in the unit. It's just me and my baby. I don't know what he's talking about." Jordan's mind clicked into place, piecing together the situation almost instantly. False lease violations. Classic predatory landlord behavior. He'd read about it before. He stepped forward before he could stop himself. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady. Tasha turned, startled, her face wary as she looked at him. "I couldn't help but overhear," he continued. "Your landlord is saying you violated the lease because of occupancy limits?" Tasha blinked, taken aback. "Yes?" she said hesitantly. "He says I have too many people living there, but it's just me and my daughter." Jordan nodded, already forming a plan. "Do you have a copy of your lease?" She hesitated again, her eyes scanning him, clearly uncertain of why this teenage boy was suddenly interested in her problem. Yes, I keep everything in a folder at home." Jordan's expression didn't waver. "Let me help you." Tasha let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Kid, I don't think—" "Trust me," Jordan interrupted, his voice firm. "I've seen this before. I think you have a case." He expected her to argue, to dismiss him like most adults did, but instead she just stared at him, searching his face for something. She looked exhausted, defeated. And for whatever reason, maybe desperation, maybe instinct, she nodded. "Horret," she whispered. "Horret." Jordan didn't know then that he had just stepped onto a battlefield, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away. Tasha sat across from Jordan at her small, cluttered kitchen table, hands gripping a thick folder of documents like it was the last piece of stability she had left. The apartment was small but spotless. A well-loved space with toys neatly stacked in the corner and a single framed photo of her and her daughter on the counter. Jordan flipped through the lease agreement, scanning each clause with the meticulous attention of someone who had done this 100 times before. His finger paused on a paragraph buried deep in the fine print. There it was, just as he had suspected. "You said he claims you violated the occupancy limit, right?" he asked without looking up. Tasha nodded, anxiety clear in her eyes. Jordan tapped the document. "There is no numerical limit listed in this lease. It just states that all residents must be disclosed." "And you said you reported your daughter when you moved in?" "From day one," she said immediately. "I filled out the paperwork, listed her name, everything. He knew she was here." Jordan nodded, already making notes in his legal pad. "Then he doesn't have a case. He's hoping you don't know that." He flipped to another section. "And this rent increase he tried to push on you? That's illegal. The lease clearly states a fixed rate for the duration of your agreement. He can't just change that unless there's a legal provision for it, which there isn't." Tasha exhaled shakily, pressing her hands to her forehead. "So what do I do?" Jordan sat back. "First, we send a formal legal notice demanding he rescind the eviction and acknowledge the lease's original terms. If he ignores it, we file in small claims court." He met her eyes, steady and certain. "And we win." 2 days later, Jordan hand-delivered the notice to the landlord's office, standing firm as the receptionist raised a skeptical brow at the sight of a teenager handing over legal documents. "Make sure he gets that," he said, voice even, before turning and walking out without waiting for a response. He already knew how this would play out. The landlord didn't just ignore the notice. He doubled down. A new eviction notice appeared on Tasha's door the next morning, this time with an aggressive threat of forced removal if she didn't vacate within a week. That was all Jordan needed. He gathered every piece of evidence, filed the case, and within 24 hours, the court had accepted it. The moment the paperwork became public record, word spread like wildfire. First it was whispers among tenants in the building, then it was social media, where someone posted a photo of the legal filing with the caption, "A 16-year-old just sued a slumlord. What are you doing today?" By the next evening, local news stations were calling, wanting interviews. Some people celebrated him, calling him a prodigy, a revolutionary. Others scoffed, claiming he was just a kid playing pretend, that he had no real authority, that he was embarrassing himself. Jordan ignored them all. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that the fight had begun, and he had no intention of losing. Jordan sat at his grandfather's desk, the dim light from the old brass lamp casting long shadows across the stacks of legal books and case files spread before him. His fingers skimmed through housing statutes, past rulings on wrongful evictions, and legal loopholes often exploited by landlords who knew their tenants couldn't afford to fight back. But Tasha wasn't alone. She had him. He knew the law, knew exactly how to tear the landlord's argument apart. But knowing wasn't enough. This wasn't just about facts. It was about perception. No one in that courtroom would see him as an equal. Henry stood in the doorway watching him work. You ready for this?" His voice was calm but carried weight, like a man who had seen too many battles to underestimate any of them. Jordan didn't look up. "They're gonna underestimate me," he said quietly. Henry let out a dry chuckle. "Good. That's when people make mistakes." Jordan knew he was right, but it didn't make it easier. He had already heard the murmurs in the legal community. Some attorneys thought he was just a media stunt, a bold teenager looking for attention. Others admired his guts, but doubted he'd survive the reality of a courtroom. He wasn't a law student, wasn't an intern under the wing of a seasoned lawyer. He was a kid, and to them that was enough to disqualify him before he even spoke. He turned another page, highlighting key precedents he'd used to dismantle the case. His strategy was clear: expose the landlord's lies, prove the eviction was baseless, and push the judge into a position where ruling against Tasha would be legally indefensible. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed with reporters, curious lawyers, and skeptics who had shown up just to watch the so-called teen lawyer crash and burn. Jordan walked through the crowd, head high, Tasha beside him. He could feel the weight of every gaze, the whispered comments, the smirks exchanged between attorneys. He ignored them. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe, exhaling heavily as he settled into his chair. His expression was already laced with impatience. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, before lifting his gaze to Jordan. He raised an eyebrow, as if seeing him for the first time, then let out a scoff that echoed through the silent room. "You must be joking." Jordan remained still, his face unreadable. The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know what kind of school project this is, but I have a docket full of real cases today. This is a court, not a school debate." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Jordan's grip on his folder tightened slightly, but he refused to react. Tasha shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Jordan," she whispered, but he shook his head once, signaling her to let him handle it. He took a step forward, voice steady. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I am here representing my client in accordance with her constitutional right to due process. If the defense has no objections, I'd like to proceed." The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. He had expected hesitation, stammering, maybe even an apology. Instead, he got confidence. He wasn't sure he liked that. "Fine," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's see how long this little performance lasts." The moment Jordan walked out of the courthouse, the flashes hit him like a wall of light. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones stretching toward him, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Jordan Ellis, do you really think you can win this case against an experienced legal team? How does it feel knowing Judge Whitmore mocked you in court? Is this just a stunt for attention?" Tasha clutched her daughter's hand, keeping her head down as they pushed through the crowd. Jordan kept his face blank, refusing to let them see frustration or doubt. A few people in the crowd clapped as he passed, murmurs of support mixed with skeptical whispers. "That kid's got guts. He's wasting his time. I hope he wins. What's he trying to prove?" Within hours, the internet exploded. News stations ran segments on the teen who thinks he's a lawyer. Social media debates raged, some hailing him as a prodigy, others tearing him down. One post went viral, a screenshot of Jordan standing at the plaintiff's table, captioned, "If this kid wins, I'll go to law school tomorrow." The comment section was a war zone. "This kid is brilliant. This system needs more people like him. He's 16. There's no way he's actually handling this case alone. That's reckless. The law isn't a game. Tell me why a teenager knows more about housing laws than half the country?" News stations scrambled to interview legal experts, and the responses were split. Some respected what he was doing, saying he was an inspiration. Others dismissed him outright, calling it dangerous, a mockery of the justice system, and even a childish attempt at activism. A well-known conservative commentator sneered on live television, "This boy needs to focus on school and leave real lawyering to the professionals." Jordan didn't respond to any of it. He had nothing to prove to them. The only person that mattered was Tasha, and the only thing that mattered was winning. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, case files spread out in front of him, his laptop open to a database of legal rulings. His grandfather sat across from him, stirring a cup of tea, watching him with the kind of patience only years of experience could bring. Finally, Henry spoke. "You know, they laughed at me too, boy." Jordan looked up, brow furrowing. Henry leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp with memory. "Back when I was protesting in the 60s, standing on courthouse steps just like you, they laughed, called us fools, said we had no business standing up to men in suits who'd been running things for decades. They told us to sit down, shut up, know our place. You know what we did?" Jordan knew the answer before the words even left his mouth. "You proved them wrong." A slow, proud smile stretched across Henry's face. "Damn right we did." Jordan exhaled, sitting back for the first time in hours. The weight of everything pressed down on him, but it wasn't heavy enough to break him. "They're going to come at me harder." Henry nodded. "Good. That means they know you're a threat." Jordan closed his laptop and cracked his knuckles. "Then I better be ready for war." The next morning, the tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The gallery was even more crowded than before, packed with reporters, legal analysts, and spectators eager to witness the so-called teen lawyer crash and burn. Judge Whitmore took his seat with an air of exaggerated boredom, adjusting his robe before exhaling loudly. "All right, let's get this over with," he muttered, his tone dripping with impatience. His eyes flicked toward Jordan, filled with something almost amused, as if this was all an inconvenience to him. "Mr. Ellis, I assume you've had enough fun playing attorney. Are you ready to move on from this little charade?" Jordan didn't flinch. "I'm prepared to proceed, Your Honor." "Shocking," the judge deadpanned before turning to the defense table. "Let's hear what the actual lawyers have to say first." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Jordan clenched his jaw but forced himself to remain still. He knew this was going to happen. He knew the judge would try to make a spectacle of him. He also knew that the moment he lost his composure, he would become exactly what they expected, a kid out of his depth. As the defense attorney began to speak, Jordan jotted down notes, ignoring the sneers from across the room. Every few minutes, just as he opened his mouth to object or request clarification, Judge Whitmore cut him off. "Move along, Mr. Ellis. We don't have all day. You may have time for high school debates, but this court does not. If you're just going to repeat the obvious, spare us all." Murmurs stirred through the courtroom. People were noticing it now. The way the judge dismissed Jordan before he could even finish a sentence, the way he allowed the defense free rein while cutting Jordan off at every turn. A few journalists exchanged glances, scribbling down notes. Even some of the legal observers looked uneasy. Tasha sat stiffly beside Jordan, her hands clenched together, her knuckles white. Jordan felt the heat rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Instead of reacting, he waited. And when his turn came, when the judge finally turned his disinterested gaze toward him and said, "Let's get this over with," Jordan stood. "As I was saying, Your Honor, the eviction notice my client received is not only unlawful, but intentionally deceptive." His voice was sharp, controlled, cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. "The defense claims my client violated her lease, yet the lease agreement states no such restriction on occupancy. Furthermore," Judge Whitmore sighed loudly. "Mr. Ellis, do you always take this long to get to the point?" Jordan paused, then tilted his head slightly, his voice steady. "Would you like me to speak faster, Your Honor, or would you like me to speak less?" A few gasps rippled through the room. The judge's eyes flashed, his jaw tightening. "Watch yourself." Jordan held his gaze. "I intend to, Your Honor." A tense silence settled over the courtroom. The power had shifted, just slightly, but enough for people to feel it. Whitmore leaned back, nostrils flaring. Jordan did. Across the room, the landlord, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit, leaned toward his attorney and whispered something with a smirk. Then, as Jordan continued speaking, the man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "This is a waste of time," he muttered, just loud enough for the nearest people to hear. He turned slightly, his gaze locking onto Jordan with open disdain. This kid's just another smart-mouthed punk trying to play hero. Jordan's hand tightened around his pen. He forced himself not to react, but the words struck a nerve, and he could feel the heat crawling up his spine. The landlord wasn't done. "A kid like you, thinking you belong here," he scoffed. "You should be out playing basketball or rapping or whatever it is your kind does instead of pretending you understand the law." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the gallery. Tasha sucked in a breath beside him, her face going pale. Even some of the lawyers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Jordan set his pen down with deliberate care. He straightened his shoulders, turned to face the landlord, and gave him a slow, unreadable smile. "I appreciate the career advice," he said, voice calm, lethal, precise, "but I'll stick to winning cases." The landlord's smirk faltered just slightly. Jordan turned back to the judge. "May I continue, Your Honor?" For a moment, Whitmore didn't respond. Then, begrudgingly, he nodded. "Make it quick." Jordan nodded once, picked up his pen, and continued without missing a beat. But everyone in that courtroom knew what had just happened. The landlord had played his hand, and Jordan Ellis was about to make him regret it. The tension in the room thickened, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface. Jordan could feel every set of eyes on him, waiting for him to react, waiting for him to prove them right, to lash out, to crumble, to show he was nothing more than a kid who didn't belong. But instead of anger, a slow, calculated fire burned in his chest. He met the landlord's sneering gaze and then swept his eyes over the room before finally resting them on Judge Whitmore. "My place," he repeated, his voice measured, sharp as a blade. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, let them settle deep into the silence. Then he stepped forward, standing tall, his hands resting firmly on the table. "My place is here, fighting for justice. Something this court is supposed to stand for." Gasps rippled through the gallery, hushed but undeniable. Even the most skeptical reporters scribbled faster. The judge's smirk faltered for the briefest second, his fingers tightening around his gavel before he masked it with another slow, exaggerated sigh. "Enough grandstanding, Mr. Ellis," he said, but his voice wasn't as dismissive as before. It held something else now, something almost wary. "Get on with your argument." Jordan nodded once, locking eyes with the landlord before turning back to his notes. "As I was saying, Your Honor, the defense has failed to provide any substantial evidence supporting the claim that my client violated her lease. What they have provided is conjecture, false allegations, and intimidation tactics designed to force her out of her home. But what they lack, what they will always lack, is the truth." The opposing attorney cleared his throat loudly, pushing back from his table. "Your Honor, if I may?" Judge Whitmore waved a hand. "Go ahead, Mr. Calloway." The defense attorney smirked, reaching into his folder and pulling out a thick stack of documents. "We'd like to introduce new evidence into the record," he announced smoothly. "Financial records that indicate Ms. Green has been receiving unreported income, calling into question her claims of financial hardship." Tasha's face drained of color. Jordan tensed beside her. He knew exactly what this was. A last-minute ambush, a desperate ploy to shift the narrative. Jordan immediately stepped forward. "Objection, Your Honor. These so-called financial records were not disclosed prior to this hearing, nor were they included in any pre-trial filings." The judge barely looked at him. "And?" Jordan straightened his shoulders. "And the defense is introducing them at the 11th hour with no time for verification. There's no proof of authenticity, no certification of source. This is a blatant attempt to blindside my client." Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. "We have the right to present new evidence as it becomes available, Your Honor. Mr. Ellis should know that if he intends to play lawyer." Laughter scattered through the crowd, but Jordan didn't react. He kept his gaze locked on Whitmore. "Your Honor, if the court allows this, we are setting a dangerous precedent, one that favors deception over due process." The judge watched him for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he sighed, tapping his gavel against the bench. "Overruled, the evidence will be admitted." Tasha let out a sharp breath beside him. Jordan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. He had just been thrown into a game dirtier than he had anticipated, and now he had to find a way to beat it. Before Jordan could even process his next move, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A wave of uniformed officers swept in, their heavy boots echoing against the marble floor. The murmurs in the gallery turned into a frenzy of gasps and shocked whispers as two officers moved swiftly toward Jordan. "Jordan Ellis," one of them announced, voice clipped and authoritative. "You are under investigation for submitting falsified evidence to the court. You need to come with us." For the first time since the trial began, Jordan felt a jolt of real surprise. His mind raced to process what was happening, but before he could speak, before he could even demand to see the charges, one of the officers grabbed his wrist, snapping a cold metal handcuff around it. Tasha shot to her feet. "No," she cried, reaching for him, but another officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "This is insane! He didn't do anything wrong!" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters leapt up, cameras flashing wildly, capturing every second of the moment. Some lawyers at the defense table were smirking, their satisfaction barely concealed. Judge Whitmore sat back, his expression unreadable, his gavel resting in his hand but unmoving. Jordan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. "This is a scare tactic," he said, his voice steady despite the anger rising in his chest. "I have done nothing illegal, and you know it." The officer ignored him, securing the second cuff. "We'll discuss that at the station." The bailiff hesitated as if unsure whether to intervene, but the judge gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Tasha was still shouting, "You're arresting a kid for doing his job? For standing up for me?" Jordan turned his head toward her, offering the smallest nod. "It's okay," he murmured. "Stay strong." And then they dragged him away. The holding cell smelled like sweat and disinfectant, the walls painted a dull gray that made the space feel even smaller than it was. Jordan sat on the metal bench, hands resting on his lap, his mind still working through the setup. He knew exactly what this was. The landlord's team had realized they were losing, so they were playing the dirtiest card they had left. Discredit him, humiliate him, force him off the case. The door creaked open, and two detectives stepped inside. One of them, a balding man with a coffee stain on his shirt, pulled up a chair across from Jordan and sat down heavily. He studied him for a moment before speaking. "Son, you're in a lot of trouble." Jordan didn't respond. He simply tilted his head slightly, waiting. The detective sighed. "This is the part where you tell us the truth, where you admit you doctored those documents and maybe we cut you a deal." Jordan let out a slow breath. "If you had any real proof, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation." The second officer, younger and more impatient, leaned forward. "You think you're smart, kid? You think just because you can argue in a courtroom, you can outmaneuver the law?" Jordan's gaze was like steel. "I think," he said carefully, "that if you don't charge me with something, you're going to have a real problem explaining why you detained a minor without just cause." The older detective's jaw tightened, but before he could say another word, the door to the interrogation room swung open with force. Henry Ellis stood in the doorway, flanked by a furious-looking attorney Jordan recognized, one of Henry's old friends from his civil rights days. Henry's voice was dangerously calm. "Unless you plan on charging my grandson, I suggest you take those cuffs off right now." The room was dead silent. The detectives exchanged glances, weighing their options. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, the balding detective sighed and nodded toward the younger officer. The handcuffs clicked open. Jordan stood, rolling his wrists slightly, then met his grandfather's gaze. Henry's face was lined with worry, but beneath it was something else. Pride. "You okay?" Henry asked, voice low. Jordan nodded once. "I will be." Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, because they just declared war." When Jordan walked back into the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the gallery, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Reporters scrambled to adjust their cameras, legal analysts whispered among themselves, and even the spectators who had come expecting his downfall now sat up straighter, sensing something had shifted. He was supposed to be gone. He was supposed to be humiliated, broken, another cautionary tale about why kids didn't belong in a courtroom. And yet, here he was, unshaken. Tasha let out a breath of relief as she spotted him, gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table like she was afraid he'd disappear again. The landlord, however, stiffened in his seat, his smirk from earlier now gone. Even the defense attorney, Mr. Calloway, lost some of his cocky confidence as he quickly whispered something to his client. Judge Whitmore, who had remained perfectly composed all morning, leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled as he studied Jordan. For the first time since this trial had begun, the judge didn't look amused. He looked uncomfortable. Jordan adjusted his suit jacket, took his seat beside Tasha, and calmly opened his case file as if nothing had happened. "Shall we continue, Your Honor?" His voice was even, professional, completely unfazed. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment he didn't respond, as though deciding whether to acknowledge what had just happened. Then, with an exhale, he shifted in his chair. "Proceed." Jordan nodded and stood, stepping toward the bench with the same quiet confidence he had displayed since day one. "Before we move forward, I'd like to address the matter of the financial records that were introduced yesterday," he said, his voice crisp, measured. "Specifically, the ones claiming my client has been receiving unreported income." Calloway leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly, as if waiting for Jordan to admit defeat. "Oh? And what exactly do you think you're going to prove?" Jordan didn't even glance at him. Instead, he held up a document and walked toward the judge's bench. "I did some digging last night," he said, placing the paper in front of Whitmore. "This is a full report from an independent forensic accounting firm. It verifies that the account these so-called payments came from is owned by a company called Harmony Solutions." Calloway's smirk twitched. Jordan continued, voice steady. "Harmony Solutions is a shell company. It doesn't provide services, doesn't have employees, and exists for one reason: financial fraud. And as of this morning, I can officially confirm that the registered owner of that shell company is none other than the defendant, Mr. Reynolds." The reaction was instant. A stunned silence gripped the room, followed by a wave of shocked whispers. Reporters fumbled for their phones, attorneys in the gallery exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the landlord's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Jordan turned toward the defense table, tilting his head slightly. "So tell me, Mr. Calloway, if my client was receiving payments from this account, wouldn't that mean your own client was paying her? And if that's the case, doesn't that completely invalidate your argument?" Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it, his face pale. The landlord slammed a fist against the table. "This is ridiculous," he bellowed. Judge Whitmore, who had been silently reading the report, finally looked up, his jaw tight. "Mr. Calloway, do you have a response?" Calloway swallowed hard. "Your Honor, we would need time to verify." "You've had time," Jordan cut in. "You introduced this evidence yesterday without warning. Now that the truth is out, you want more time?" Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply. He had no love for Jordan, but he knew when a case was slipping beyond his control. "Mr. Calloway," he said, voice heavy, "unless you have an immediate counter-argument, I am prepared to rule on this matter now." Calloway opened his mouth again, but no words came out. The judge tapped his gavel once, his expression dark. "Then this court finds in favor of the plaintiff." For the first time since this trial began, Jordan let himself smile. He had won. Before the courtroom could fully absorb the shock of Judge Whitmore's ruling, the doors swung open with force. The sharp clap of dress shoes against the marble floor echoed through the stunned silence as a team of federal agents flooded the room, their navy puelled jackets emblazoned with bold yellow letters, FBI. The tension that had already been thick now solidified into something suffocating. Gasps rippled through the gallery, reporters clutching their microphones as cameras zeroed in on the agents storming toward the defense table. "Hey, Mr. Reynolds," the lead agent announced, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You are under arrest for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit housing violations." The landlord's face twisted in rage. "What? This is insane! You can't do this!" He tried to stand, but two agents grabbed his arms, yanking him up as they snapped handcuffs around his wrists. His eyes darted wildly, searching for Calloway, for the judge, for anyone who could save him, but all he saw were blank stares and reporters frantically capturing the moment. "This is a mistake," Reynolds shouted as they pulled him toward the exit, his voice wild with desperation. "I didn't do anything wrong. That little punk set me up." Jordan didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply watched as the man who had tried to rip Tasha from her home was dragged out in cuffs. Judge Whitmore, for the first time since the trial began, looked unsettled. His grip on the bench tightened, his face eerily pale. He knew what this meant. He had backed Reynolds, mocked Jordan, allowed fraudulent evidence into his courtroom, and now, with the FBI involved, his own reputation was hanging by a thread. The agents disappeared through the doors, and then for a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. And then, applause. It started with one person, then two, then the entire gallery erupted into thunderous cheers. Tasha let out a choked sob, covering her mouth as her body trembled. Then, suddenly, she turned and threw her arms around Jordan, squeezing him so tightly he could barely breathe. You did it," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice shaking. "You really did it." Jordan let out a breath, his arms wrapping around her in return. He wasn't used to this raw, open emotion, this overwhelming gratitude, but he felt it, deep in his chest. Reporters surged forward, pushing microphones toward him. "Jordan Ellis, you just took down a corrupt landlord at 16 years old. How do you feel?" "Bro, Jordan, people are already calling you the youngest legal warrior. What's next for you?" "Jordan, do you plan to go to law school early? Join a firm?" He didn't answer at first. He just took it all in. The flashing lights, the murmurs of admiration, the way Tasha's daughter clung to her mother, no longer afraid of losing their home. This wasn't just a case. This was a turning point. Henry Ellis stood near the back, watching it all unfold with a knowing smile. He didn't step in, didn't say a word, because he already knew Jordan didn't need him to. The boy had stepped into his own power. Jordan finally turned toward the reporters, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of something much bigger than himself. "This isn't about me," he said simply. "This is about justice, and this is just the beginning." The courtroom victory had barely settled before the shadows of reality crept back in. That night, long after the cameras had stopped flashing and the reporters had packed up their mics, Jordan walked alone toward his grandfather's car, parked just beyond the courthouse steps. The crisp night air had a lingering tension, something unspoken yet undeniable. His mind was still replaying every second of the trial, every word Judge Whitmore had thrown at him, every calculated move that had led to Reynolds being dragged away in cuffs. He had won, but why did it still feel like the war wasn't over? He was only a few steps from the car when a figure emerged from the darkness, leaning casually against a nearby street lamp. A man in a dark suit, older but sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made people uneasy without knowing why. His face was unreadable, but his smirk held something close to amusement. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" the man said smoothly, his voice laced with something Jordan couldn't quite place. Mockery? Warning? Jordan's steps slowed. He didn't flinch, didn't let his pulse betray him. "And you are?" The man pushed off the lamppost, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine jacket. "Someone who gives good advice. And my advice to you, kid? Walk away. Take your little win and go back to being a normal teenager. Because the people you're messing with, they don't like losing, and they don't play fair." Jordan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained cool. "Neither do I." The man exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But boldness only gets you so far. You're stepping into a game you don't understand, and if you're not careful, you won't just lose, you'll disappear." Jordan's fists clenched, but he kept them at his sides. His heart was pounding, but not from fear, from rage. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about every tenant who had been pushed out of their home, every family manipulated by the system, every person who didn't have a voice. He stepped forward, closing the space between them until only inches remained. He met the man's gaze, his voice unwavering. "Tell them, if they're scared of me now, they should be terrified of what comes next." The man's smirk faded just slightly. He studied Jordan for a moment longer, then let out a slow, resigned sigh. "Suit yourself, kid," he murmured, before stepping back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had come. But Jordan didn't move for a long time, because he knew this wasn't a warning, it was a promise. By the next morning, Jordan was already at work. If they thought fear would stop him, they had underestimated him again. Sitting at his grandfather's kitchen table, he sketched out the blueprint for something bigger than himself. A legal defense group, a force dedicated to protecting people like Tasha. A coalition of lawyers, activists, and researchers who would ensure that what happened in that courtroom wouldn't just be a one-time victory, but the start of something unstoppable. He called it the Justice League. It started small, just Jordan, Henry, and a few volunteers from the community. But within weeks, calls started pouring in. Single mothers facing illegal evictions, elderly tenants being strong-armed into signing away their leases, working-class families who were being preyed upon by the same kind of landlords who had tried to break Tasha. Jordan took every case he could, learning, strategizing, fighting. He pored over property laws, found loopholes, built arguments that left corporate attorneys scrambling. It wasn't just about knowing the law, it was about using it better than those who had been exploiting it for decades. And the more cases he won, the more people took notice. Some celebrated him, calling him a modern-day legal prodigy, the future of civil rights law. Others despised him, calling him a troublemaker, a reckless kid who didn't know when to quit. But Jordan didn't care about praise or criticism. He only cared about results. Then came the case that nearly broke everything. It started with a phone call. A woman named Maria Lopez, a mother of 3, had been given a sudden eviction notice. But this wasn't just a normal eviction. Her entire apartment complex had been bought out by a mysterious group of investors. They were clearing the building to turn it into luxury condos, forcing out dozens of families. Jordan dug deeper. The company behind the deal was a familiar name, Harmony Solutions, the same shell company Reynolds had used. Jordan knew exactly what this was. The landlords and corporate investors hadn't just shrugged off Reynolds' downfall. They had absorbed it, learned from it. They were working smarter now, moving money through new loopholes, finding new ways to push out low-income tenants without legal repercussions. They thought Jordan wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong. He worked day and night, unraveling the paper trail, tracing the money back to the same corrupt developers who had been skimming profits from illegal evictions. He prepared his case, building it piece by piece, just like before. But this time, he didn't just plan to stop the evictions, he planned to dismantle the entire operation. The day of the investor meeting, Jordan didn't wait for the fight to come to him. He walked straight into the lion's den, a sleek, high-rise office in downtown Atlanta, a boardroom full of men in tailored suits discussing the future of their multi-million-dollar investment. They didn't expect him to be there. But he was. When he strode into the conference room, a heavy silence fell over the executives. Some glanced at each other, confused. Others recognized him instantly, their faces darkening. One of them, a man with silver hair and a predator's smile, leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Jordan set a thick folder on the table, his voice calm but lethal. "I'm the person who's about to ruin your entire business plan." He opened the file and began laying out the evidence. The fraudulent leases, the falsified records, the illegal maneuvering to force tenants out before their contracts expired. Every single thread connecting this deal to a corrupt operation designed to displace families for profit. At first, they tried to laugh him off. Then they realized he had proof, and when he pulled out a final document, a formal complaint ready to be filed with the state attorney general, the room erupted into chaos. One investor stood abruptly. "We need to reconsider this deal." Another shook his head furiously. "This kid's bluffing." One man turned to his assistant. "Cancel the lease terminations." Within minutes, the meeting was over. The deal collapsed. The investors fled, not willing to risk getting caught in a legal firestorm. And just like that, Jordan had won again. As he walked out of the high-rise building, Henry was waiting for him on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a knowing grin on his face. "You really don't quit, do you?" Jordan exhaled, a slow smirk playing at his lips. "Not when there's still work to do." Because this wasn't just about one case. This was war. Years passed, but Jordan never stopped fighting. What had started as a single case, a desperate attempt to protect one family, had grown into something unstoppable. By the time he turned 21, he had already passed the bar exam, officially becoming one of the youngest licensed attorneys in the country. By 25, he had built the Justice League into a national organization, with chapters in multiple cities, each dedicated to fighting housing discrimination, wrongful evictions, and corporate greed. The name Jordan Ellis was no longer whispered in courtrooms. It was spoken with reverence by those who admired him, and with fear by those who sought to silence him. Landlords who had once operated without consequence now treaded carefully. Corrupt real estate moguls, the same ones who had dismissed him as a naive kid, now had to answer to the reforms he helped pass. The Justice League had changed the game. They provided free legal aid to low-income families, exposed predatory housing practices, and helped draft new tenant protection laws that forced accountability where there had been none before. His organization partnered with activists, policymakers, and civil rights groups to reshape housing laws across the country. He was no longer just a teenage prodigy fighting against the system. He was the system's reckoning. And yet, despite the victories, Jordan never lost sight of what truly mattered. He never stopped showing up for the people who needed him most. While his name filled headlines and law journals, he still sat in tiny apartments with single mothers facing eviction, still walked through neglected housing complexes with tenants demanding repairs, still stood in courtrooms, staring down landlords who thought they were untouchable. One evening, after a long day in court, Jordan stood outside an apartment building where his latest case had just been won. A young boy, no older than 8, ran up to him, gripping a tattered notebook. "Mr. Ellis, sir." The boy's eyes were wide with excitement. "I watched your trial today. I want to be a lawyer just like you." Jordan crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze with a small smile. "You want to fight for people?" The boy nodded, gripping the notebook tighter. "I want to stop bad guys from hurting families." Jordan exhaled, his chest tightening with something that felt dangerously close to pride. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his pen, and handed it to the boy. "Then start now," he said. "Learn everything you can. Speak up when something's wrong. Never let them tell you that you don't belong." The boy grinned, gripping the pen like it was a sword. Jordan straightened and watched as the boy ran back to his mother, chattering excitedly about all the cases he was going to win someday. And in that moment, Gordon knew this was why he had never given up. Later that night, he sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond his window. He turned on the camera, looking directly into the lens. "The fight for justice never ends, but I'll never stop fighting." He let the silence stretch for a beat, then leaned forward slightly. "What would you do if you saw injustice? Would you fight back?" His voice was calm but firm, the same confidence that had carried him through that first courtroom battle still burning within him. One person can change the system, but only if they refuse to be silenced. And as the screen faded to black, the message was clear. This was only the beginning. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every voice matters, every action counts, and together we can create a world where justice is not just a privilege, but a right for all. Stand up, speak out, and never let them tell you that change is impossible. Because the truth is, Change starts with you.